Emily Elizabeth Dickinson was born into a privileged life in Amherst, Massachusetts, on December 10, 1830, to Edward Dickinson and Emily Norcross Dickinson. She had an older brother, William Austin Dickinson, and a younger sister, Lavinia Norcross Dickinson. Growing up, domestic duties such as baking and gardening occupied her time, along with attending school, taking part in church activities, reading books, learning to sing and play the piano, writing letters, and taking walks. She attended Amherst Academy for about 7 years before going to Mount Holyoke Female Seminary in 1847. She stayed at the seminary for 1 year, the longest time she spent away from home. Growing up, the Dickinson family were devout Calvinists. Calvinists are people who believe they are born as sinners and must be saved with conversion. Emily Dickinson never underwent a Calvinist conversion, but she seems to have been significantly influenced by the tenets of her faith. Emily Dickinson was a rebel when it came to religion and social proprieties. She did attend church regularly until her 30s. She called herself a pagan and wrote about the merits of science over religion. She was not big on in-person social interactions. She preferred to communicate with most of her friends through letters. Dickinson neither married nor had children. The identity of the man she loved is a mystery. In the 3 master letters written between 1858 and 1862, Dickinson addresses Master, a mystery man with whom she was passionately in love with. Scholars have suggested that Master may have been Dickinson's mentor, a newspaper editor, a reverend, an Amherst student, God, or even a fictional muse. Nearly 2 decades later, Dickinson started a relationship with Judge Otis Lord, a widowed friend of her father's. Lord proposed to Emily in 1883. He didn't get an answer. Then in 1884, he passed away. She described her mother as cold and unloving. Later in life, when her mother fell ill, Dickinson apparently did begin to feel more affectionate for her. Emily Dickinson had a strained relationship with both of her parents. She chose to never move out of her family home, but it was not because she got along with her parents. Her father was involved in politics, served in Congress for 1 term, a well-regarded lawyer for the Whig Party, and was a United States Senator. She seemed more amicable with her father, but he was said to have been unsupportive of female scholars. This might explain why Dickinson chose never to reveal her large collection of poetry. She lived near her family for her entire life. Although she spends most of her adult life isolated from the world, she maintained a close relationship with her brother and sister. Austin, her brother, with his wife and 3 children, lived next door to her in a property called the Evergreens. Dickinson was close friends with Austin's wife, Susan, who she regularly exchanged letters with. Lavinia, her sister, who was also a spinster, lived with her at the Dickinson family home. Dickinson had a big green thumb. Throughout her life, she was a major gardener. On her family's property, she grew hundreds of flowers, planted vegetables, and cared for apples, cherries, and pear trees. She also oversaw the family's greenhouse, which contained jasmine, gardenias, carnations, and ferns, and she often referred to the plants in her poetry. Emily Dickinson began having troubles with her eyes. Bright light would hurt her, and her eyes ached when she tried to read or write. After a year of them hurting, she visited Dr. Henry Willard Williams, a respected optometrist in Boston. During her treatment, she had to avoid reading, writing with a pencil, and had to stay in dim lighting. By 1865, her eye symptoms went away. Emily Dickinson may have also suffered from severe anxiety. Theories for her reclusive nature include that she had extreme anxiety, epilepsy, or simply wanted to focus on her poetry. Dickinson's mother had an episode of severe depression in 1855, and Dickinson wrote in an 1862 letter that she herself experienced a terror about which she couldn't tell anyone. Two of Dickinson's most popular poems were Because I Could Not Stop for Death and Hope.
Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. The carriage held but just ourselves and immortality. We slowly drove, he knew no haste, and I had put away my labor and my leisure too for his civility. We passed the school where children played at wrestling in a ring. We passed the fields of gazing grain, we passed the setting sun. We paused before a house that seemed a swelling of the ground. The roof was scarcely visible, the cornice but a mound. Since then 'tis centuries, but each feels shorter than the day I first surmised the horses' heads were toward eternity.
Hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings the tune without the words and never stops at all. And sweetest in the gale is heard, and sore must be the storm that could abash the little bird that kept so many warm. I've heard it in the chillest land and on the strangest sea, yet never, in extremity, it asked a crumb of me.
It wasn't until after her death on May 15, 1886, when about 1,800 other poems were discovered. She kept the majority of her work to herself. When Lavinia discovered her sister's poems, she did not know what to do with them, so she evenly spread them out to herself, her sister-in-law, and Todd. The poems that were published during her lifetime were mainly done so anonymously without her consent. She never published anything under her own name. Emily's poetry was heavily influenced by her reading of the Book of Revelation as well as her Puritan upbringing, which encouraged a Calvinist, orthodox, and conservative approach to Christianity. She admired poetry of Elizabeth Barrett Browning and John Keats. Emily heard rumors advising against Walt Whitman, but Dickinson and Whitman are connected as founders of a unique American voice in poetry. Emily Dickinson is considered to be one of the leading 19th century American poets. Emily Dickinson was not a fan of traditional punctuation. Her approach to poetry was unconventional. As her original manuscripts revealed, she interspersed her writing with many dashed and varying lengths of orientation. Early editors cleaned up her unconventional markings, publishing her poems without her original notions. Scholars still debate how Dickinson's unusual punctuation affected the rhythm and deeper meaning of her poems. In 1833, Dickinson's brother started an affair with a writer named Mabel Loomis Todd. Todd and Emily Dickinson exchanged letters but never met in person. Todd edited and published Dickinson's poetry. After Dickinson's death, her sister asked Todd to help arrange Dickinson's poems to be published. So Todd teamed up with Higginson to edit and publish Dickinson's work, creating an awkward family dynamic between Dickinson's brother, sister, and sister-in-law. After publishing the first volume in 1890, Todd and Higginson published a second collection of Dickinson's poetry the next year. Todd even wrote articles and gave lectures about the poems, and she went on to edit Dickinson's letters and third volume for her poems. On May 15, 1886, in Amherst, Massachusetts, 55-year-old Emily Elizabeth Dickinson died in her bedroom of the house she had lived in for decades due to an illness called Bright's disease. Bright's disease is a kidney disease that affects the production of urine. Modern scholars believe she died of heart failure brought on by high blood pressure. Emily Dickinson's first tombstone in Amherst's West Cemetery only displayed her initials E.E.D., but her niece, Martha Dickinson Bianchi, later gave her deceased aunt a new headstone, engraved with the poet's name, birth, and death dates, and the words, "Called Back," a reference to an 1880 novel of the same name by Hugh Conway that Dickinson enjoyed reading. In the last letter that Dickinson wrote before she died, she only wrote, "Called Back."
Harmonious like tombs. The stiff heart questions, was it he that bore, and yesterday, or centuries before? The feet mechanical go round, of ground or air, or aught. A wooden way, regardless grown, a quartz contentment like a stone. This is the hour of lead, remembered if outlived, as freezing persons recollect the snow. First, chill, then stupor, then the letting go. In vain. I cannot live with you. It would be life, and life is over there, behind the shelf. The sexton keeps the key to, putting up our life, his porcelain, like a cup, discarded of the housewife, quaint or broken. A newer Sèvres pleases, old ones crack. I could not die with you, for one must wait to shut the other's gaze down. You could not, and could I stand by and see you freeze without my right of frost, death's privilege? Nor could I rise with you, because your face would put out Jesus, that new grace, glow plain and foreign on my homesick eye, except that you than he shone closer by. They judge us. How? For you served heaven, you know, or sought to. I could not, because you saturated sight, and I had no more eyes for sordid excellence as paradise. And were you lost, I would be, though my name rang loudest on the heavenly fame. And were you saved, and I condemned to be where you were not, that self were hell to me. So we must keep apart, you there, I here, with just the door ajar that oceans are, and prayer, and that pale sustenance, despair.